Hi, everyone. We'll get started in about 30 seconds, but there's a URL on the screen. It's also in the Show More part of the description for the video today. To access our resources, there are 3 for today. They're all labeled 4-27. So there's a 4-27 handout, a prompt for lesson, and an AP practice if you want to pull those up. And then I'll see you again in about 30 seconds. All right, hello everyone. Happy Monday. I'm Emily Velitis. I'm your teacher for today. I hope you had a great weekend and you took some time just to kind of unplug and rejuvenate a little bit. For me, I put my computer away. I worked hardly at all. I spent very little time on my phone and I went for a long walk. I started reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire because I'm like, I just need something light and easy and enjoyable. So I hope that you took some time this weekend to find something that, again, kind of like rejuvenated your batteries. On Friday, we talked about a subject that's very near and dear to my heart, something that I love, and a lot of students don't, but I love talking about syntax and syntactical features. So we looked at, you can see the list here, we looked at a series of common features when it comes to syntax that students like to study in their writing or when they're looking at a particular passage. Basically, I went through each of those elements and then I went through some of those common functions. The common function is what you would include in your analysis. It's like your commentary. So you might identify an example of a long sentence, and then in your analysis, you might talk about how it builds momentum, makes the reader feel out of breath. So what's on the right-hand side of that chart, that would be your analysis, your commentary. If you didn't join us on Friday, you can go back and view that session, or you can just kind of follow along here and thinking about this particular list, maybe thinking or considering how might I apply this to my own work. So after we talked about these elements, the main thing I kept stressing is don't just randomly pick out a dash that you recognize. It all needs to be steeped in the purpose or the argument, what the writer is really trying to intend. It needs to be an intentional punctuation mark or syntactical move. So that's the other thing I'm, again, just going to keep stressing today. I know that sometimes when you're in a panic and you're looking at a passage, you see a semicolon and you're like, I'm just going to talk about this semicolon. Make sure it fits in with your existing commentary or your understanding of the writer's argument. Otherwise, it's going to come across as though you were just hunting for something to talk about, as opposed to really understanding the choices that the writer's making. So for the practice, I asked students to read a fantastic passage from The Things They Carried, and it's from the chapter titled The Man I Killed. And for the task, I gave the students a topic sentence because I wanted them to practice identifying and selecting evidence that really supports that idea. So in this case, students were asked to find evidence about that Tim O'Brien's incorporated to reflect an idealized version of the man he killed. And then I gave them a series of questions to consider to kind of help guide their reading. And then if you were to look at the passage in its entirety, it kind of shifts from an idealized version of the man to like what he's actually looking like in reality, in life. So we're only going to focus on the part that speaks to our topic sentence, which was the first paragraph and that idealized version. Of the devices that we talked about, those elements we talked about on Friday, one was the dash. And if you analyze this passage focusing on the dash, then you might have looked at this dash where he wrote, his chest was sunken and poorly muscled, dash, a scholar maybe. So we see the dash, it's there, but I don't think it really advances the purpose much. A scholar maybe is modifying the description of poorly muscled, but so I guess we do see a little bit more about him, but I don't know that it's idealized. I would also say that the purpose of the dash is to function as like an interruption. And I don't know that that's really important to capture this idea of an idealized version. So I see a dash, but I don't think it's incredibly intentional or purposeful, at least for the topic we'd be exploring. Another thing that you might have noticed is he uses a lot of short sentences. There were plenty in the passage. One that really stuck out to me, though, was this one right here. He devoted himself to his studies. And I like that one because it's sandwiched between two longer sentences. So we kind of have like long sentence, one that smacks us in the face, and then another long one. So it really draws attention to him being a student. It kind of startles us. It wakes us up as readers, and it's focusing on him as a scholar. I also like that it kind of prepares us for what's to come in the following sentence that is showing us a little bit more about who he was and what he did for his studies. So I think that that one gives me a lot to work with, especially in terms of how he's idealizing this man. You might have recognized that there was a semicolon about 3/4 of the way through that first paragraph. And a semicolon, again, is going to kind of function to take two deep independent clauses and put them together. It's when a period could have been used to really separate them. So instead, the semicolon is going to connect, unify, and in some cases, that connection might signal a division, which is what we see here. So Tim O'Brien writes, he had stopped praying, semicolon. Instead, comma, now, comma, he waited, period. And I love that that semicolon, again, it's kind of unifying those two elements, but then it still is existing in this sense of like a contrast. He stopped praying and now he's waiting. He's basically waiting for war, for death and dying. So the semicolon is smooth. If he had a period, it would seem very disjointed. Those ideas wouldn't stand in contrast to one another. So it's really clarifying how and why he's waiting because it's contrasting with how he used to pray before he got to this point before the war. So I like that it creates that pause. I like that it's smooth. It's improving the pacing of the passage. And it really helps to clarify that, again, that sharp contrast of how the man has evolved. The next thing that you might recognize is that he had a long sentence. There were several in the passage, but I was really drawn to, again, this particular one. And as he waited in his final year at the university, he ... And it continues to give a bunch of descriptions about how he fell in love and then how this girl saw him. And I love this particular sentence because we have all these descriptions that build upon each other, and they really help to paint the picture of this man as being young and childlike and in this love with another woman, with a woman. And so all of these descriptions really help to kind of set the scene for me as a reader. Even though it's a long sentence, those descriptions are helping me to picture it. And then the last thing was looking at a comma. We see that there were two phrases here, the perhaps and the maybe, that really speak to modality. They're adverbs speaking about like, well, possibly he did this and maybe he did that. And I do like those. I think that it seems as though Tim O'Brien, they're very casual, but it seems as though Tim O'Brien is kind of like making it up as he's going. It seems very informal, like he's talking to us. His chest was sunken and poorly muscled. A scholar, maybe. So it seems very informal and very casual. Or one evening, perhaps they exchanged gold rings. That it seems very like stream of consciousness, as though he's inventing the life of the man as he goes. So just to review, we looked at the topic sentence, we pulled out a series of examples and syntactical structures that maybe would work. We went through those, we looked at how they function. And if I were to go through myself and revise this particular topic sentence, I would write something like, in this passage, O'Brien incorporates short and long sentences to reflect an idealized version of the man he killed. So then my first example would be that short sentence of he devoted himself to his studies. And then I would analyze that and how it reflects this idealized version of the man, how he's committed, he's devoted to his studies. And then my second example would be that long sentence, specifically all those commas and those phrases and how they build upon each other. The others are there. I just don't have as much to say about them. All right, so moving on to our topic for today. We're going to be looking at elements within a text and consider how those parts fit together. Specifically looking at repetition, pronoun references, and parallel structure. Of those three, one, like the pronoun reference, might really inhibit your understanding of a passage. So we'll talk about that and how it functions, but I really hope that you think of how does this impact how I read a passage? And then we'll look at repetition and parallel structure. Those are two elements that a lot of students use in their essays and that they analyze. So I think that it'd be good for us to review those, how they function, and then we'll look at a sample of a student essay, an out-of-class essay that is referencing the repetition. So I'll define each, give you again some examples of professional writing, and then help you explore how they function and what you might be able to include for your commentary if you were to write about one of these things. All right, so to start with pronouns, I don't want this to feel like a grammar lesson, but just to do a quick review, I think there are two key terms you need to know, pronoun and antecedent. A pronoun's a word that's going to take the place or replace a noun. I think a lot of you know that. You're familiar with pronouns like I, me, she, we. But in this class, I think it's really important, especially when you're looking at pre-20th century texts, that you not just recognize a pronoun, but then you go back and figure out what is the antecedent. So in this case, an antecedent is a word that can't talk today. You can tell it's a Monday. A word that particular pronoun will replace. So you might think about that as though it's the original, and then the pronoun is the word that replaces it. So let me give you a quick example because I know it's tricky, and again, I'm having word vomit. I'm not making sense. So let me give you an example of that. If you had this particular passage that wrote, AP Lang videos on YouTube are riveting to watch, they prepare me for the exam. You might recognize that the pronoun here is they. And then you might have to kind of go back and look at the previous sentence to figure out what is the they that's preparing me for the exam. In this case, it's the AP Lang videos on YouTube. So they is the pronoun. The antecedent is AP Lang videos on YouTube. So the trick is look at the pronoun, but then try to go to the previous sentence sometimes too to figure out what is the subject matter, the content that that person is referring to, that they're replacing with that particular pronoun. A few things to note, again, I don't want this to be a grammar lesson. You don't need to know the various types of pronouns. I think depending on who you talk to, they're between 8 and 10, like an indefinite or a demonstrative pronoun. You don't need to know those. But I do think when you're reading a passage, again, especially a pre-20th century passage, it's important that you recognize when a writer is using pronouns, and sometimes those are vague, that you're kind of pausing and thinking, what is the they that this particular writer is referring to? Another thing to know is I think the kind of like go-to pronouns are you, we, I, me, she, he, etc. But don't forget that, and in some cases, I think that the trickiest pronouns are the ones that are like this, that, these, and most importantly, it. That a lot of times when a writer will use it, it's so they don't have this repetitive nature to their text, but make sure you know what the it is replacing and what that's referring to. If you were to analyze a pronoun and a repetition of a pronoun, a lot of students might look at something like we or I. Some common functions that you might consider would be a writer might use that to avoid repetition, or in some cases, again, like to unify. Because if the same noun is used over and over and over again, it becomes dull, a little boring. So for example, if I were to say something like, Mrs. Velitis loves teaching AP language. Mrs. Velitis has been teaching it for 15 years. Speeches are Mrs. Velitis's favorite genre in AP language. It just becomes heavy, and my last name is terrible. So we certainly don't need to say it 3 times. So then you might be utilizing some pronouns like she for the second and that third sentence. Another thing is it's going to direct the reader to the noun. So if it is something like he or she or it again makes you pause and make sure you know what that pronoun is. So it's going to direct you back to the noun itself. All right, so let's do a quick practice. This is a multiple choice, and I know that you won't have something like this on your exam in May, but I think it's a really good exercise just to practice. I see a pronoun, how do I find the antecedent? So I'm going to ask you to pause the feed and read this particular passage. I'll warn you, it's a tough text. There are a lot of challenging words here. Try not to get too overwhelmed and just stick with the practice that the tips I gave you of identify the antecedent or the pronoun, excuse me, in this case, it's it. I've circled it for you. And then try reading backwards to figure out what is the subject, what is the noun that it is replacing. In this case, you'll see that the sentence says, not wanting in a certain fanciful sprightliness, which is the peculiar grace of woman, it possesses, also in large measure, that concentrativeness which is deemed the peculiar strength of man. So you might ask yourself, especially in terms of the it, what possesses a concentrativeness which is deemed the peculiar strength of man? So you might ask yourself that as you're reading. Pause the feed and look at those 5 options and figure out which of those best captures the antecedent here. All right, are you ready for the answer? Hopefully you all guessed that it was C, my serious style. That's a really convoluted sentence there. If you were to cut out all of those descriptive phrases, that second sentence basically just reads, there is about my serious style a vigor of thought, period. It possesses also in large measure that concentrativeness. Might be an easier way to go about finding that. All right, the next element is one that a lot of you write about. It's because it's something that you recognize that stands out to you as a reader, and that's repetition. Repetition is a literary device that repeats the same word or words or phrases. The main thing I'm going to encourage you to do, we're broken records here, is always connect it back to the argument or the rhetorical situation. So if you see that a word's being repeated, it really only means something if it's going to help advance the argument. And then if you recognize an example of repetition, some things that you might be including in your analysis, in your commentary, is looking at how that particular word is being emphasized. So it might make the idea clearer, it might make it more memorable. Also, because it's being repeated, it tends to stick in the reader's minds a little bit more. They're able to absorb and understand that key idea because it's being repeated. Another thing that we'll do is provide cohesion, especially if you're looking at a text where the same word is repeated like middle or beginning, middle, and end. It's going to unify those sections. So it could also provide cohesion from one part of the text to the next. You will see repetition a lot in speeches because it's an auditory device. It's something that you can hear and people remember what they hear. So if something's being repeated frequently, you tend to notice it more in speeches. All right, again, let's look at an example. This is from a really old prompt, but it's one of my favorites. Again, I'm going to ask you to pause the feed, read through it, starting by thinking with what is her argument? What is her message? What is Nancy Mears, the writer of this piece, really trying to assert? And then identify where you see repetition and how it functions to support that argument. All right, she has a lot of repetition in this short introduction to the passage itself. Specifically, the words cripple and choose or choice, some version of a choice is seen quite frequently. In this particular passage, she's talking about how, and you can see this toward the middle, how she has chosen the word cripple, not handicapped or disabled, to describe her condition of multiple sclerosis. So it's a choice that she has made. And she knows that she could have something that's a little bit more PC, like handicapped or disabled, but she wants to make this choice. So I think it's interesting that she repeats cripple and crippled so frequently because it's really highlighting her condition. I think especially toward the bottom, like 3/4 of the way down, she has that phrase or that sentence, perhaps I want them to wince. And she says, the people wince when they hear the word cripple. So her saying it over and over and over again makes us, the reader, kind of uncomfortable and wince as well. She wants us to feel that way, hence the repetition. The other word that she uses a lot, again, choose or choice, speaks to her argument as well, because She's the actor. She's not being acted upon by this condition. She's taking control of it. She's taking back power because she is choosing this for herself. Therefore, she repeats it 4 times in one paragraph. So those two words, cripple and choose, really help kind of convey the argument and then the power that she's trying to achieve by choosing this word for her. All right, and then the last one we're going to look at is parallel structure. That is when two or more phrases or words with have similar grammatical form and length. And I want to encourage you to really focus on grammatical. That's the key here. So let me give you an example first. Ralph Waldo Emerson is quoted as saying, "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny compared to what lies within us." In this case, the parallel structure is the repetition of that phrase, what lies, what lies, what lies. By using that 3 times in a sentence, he's creating a rhythm and he's really adding emphasis to that last phrase, within us. What lies behind us, what lies before us are tiny compared to what lies within us. That rhythm helps to establish that clarity. So it would make sense then some common functions of parallel structures to establish a rhythm, create almost like a fluency to the text. It's very melodic, it flows. It might be clarifying an idea, like in this case, within us, especially when you see that these phrases are put next to each other within the same sentence or between two sentences. It will put more emphasis on them because they're in the same structure. You could also say that it adds some balance to the piece too, a sentence, but it might also be within like a larger paragraph or the whole text, that it's going to add some balance to the ideas because they are in that similar structure. Like repetition, this too would be good in a speech. A lot of writers use this in the speech because it develops this cadence. It's easier for us to remember. So speaking of speeches, here are 2 examples. The first one comes from John F. Kennedy's speech. "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty." And then in the essay Shooting an Elephant, George Orwell writes, "Some of the people said that the elephant had gone in one direction, some said that he had gone in another, some professed not to even have heard of any elephant." I'm going to ask you to pause the feed and look at both of these examples and see if you can identify where the parallelism occurs and how it functions. In the first example, you can see that the structure is a verb and any, pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, that they're all the same tense, they're followed by a verb, and they're all 3 words, which helps to establish a rhythm. Again, it makes it easier to follow and to understand. In the second example from George Orwell, they're not going to be identical. Some people said, some said that, and I think you could even make a case that that last is parallel as well with some professed. It's the some. Some people said, some said this, some professed. So it's not going to be exact, but I think it is close enough to recognize that's an intentional choice by Orwell to balance out all of those opinions and show that there's no one answer, that everyone has a different opinion about whether or not they saw the elephant and which direction the elephant went. All right, so you might be asking yourself, all right, Velitis, you've talked a lot about repetition and parallelism. Aren't they basically the same thing? And I do think that that's a common misunderstanding, a common confusion for students to have, especially because parallelism is a form of repetition. But I think the key thing to keep in mind, especially for the majority of the work that you'd be doing in AP language when you're studying a passage, is that repetition is going to be looking mostly at the words themselves, the denotations, the connotations, why that particular word is being repeated. Whereas with parallelism, yes, it is a form of repetition, but it's really more about the grammatical construction and those repeated structures and how those repeated structures create a rhythm. So repetition is more about the emphasis. Parallelism is more about the rhythm and that grammatical structure. When writing about these things, I've stressed you before that your commentary should explain the importance, relate to the rhetorical situation, and connect to the claim. I still maintain all of those, but I want to just speak a little bit to that first bullet point and explaining the importance, because there are some nuances when it comes to talking about repetition and parallelism in your own writing. And so a few things to keep in mind when you are explaining the importance, still connect back to the claim and the rhetorical situation. But when you're analyzing the example itself and looking at that particular choice, you might consider spending some time or devoting some attention to describing what the writer is doing. So what is being repeated, even just stating this has been repeated is going to be helpful. So if you were to say for parallelism, instead of parallelism, if you would have said something like structures the phrases in a similar fashion or employs a similar grammatical structure, signal to your reader what you want them to recognize. Then make sure you're relating it to the content. What content is being repeated? What is the key idea or word being repeated? Why this idea or word? What does it convey? And again, thinking about the denotations and the connotations. And then start to pull back into the function. So why is it being repeated? What is the impact on the audience or the piece as a whole? In your handouts for today, I gave you access to this particular prompt from Florence Kelly. If you want the practice of pausing the feed, taking 3 minutes to break down the prompt, 7 minutes for the speech, you certainly can. But I don't know that it's entirely necessary. I wanted to give it to you just in case. But we're going to look at a sample from this particular prompt that one of my students has written a few years ago. She wrote a few years ago. And I thought it might be helpful for you, but we're really just looking at the structure and what is the student saying. So if you don't have a firm understanding of the prompt, it's fine. I just wanted to provide it for you just in case. Okay, so first things first, this is a student essay that was written out of class with plenty of time, and I think it's pretty good. I think it's really sophisticated and has complex ideas. This is not anything I would expect in a timed writing, so please keep that in mind as you're reading it. But I want you to pause the feed, read through the student sample, and identify when the student is describing the device itself. You can see by the topic sentence, it will be repetition. So when and where does the student describe the repetition and provide an example? When and where does the student explain the content that's being repeated? And then where does the student describe the function? So think about how this particular student constructs a response about repetition and where you see those elements. All right. One of the first things that you might have noticed is that the student describes the device kind of in two places. The student says there's the repetition of phrases, and then later in the paragraph says, similar to a cycle, Kelly consistently repeats these three phrases. That's good enough for me. The student's referencing the choice, describing it, works for me. Then the students explain the content by saying, that these examples she provides them and says, this creates a portrayal of their society in which parents neglect to see the exploitation of their children. So she's summarizing the content itself. She's not going to include everything, just some of the major pieces that are being repeated and what those things are saying. So she's summarizing them. You might have noticed that she's describing the function in two places, but the first comes about halfway through when the student writes, she does this, she consistently repeats these three phrases to symbolize how the same problems and causes will continue to arise and occur without intervention. Just pretty nice that she's thinking about the symbolic function. The student then continues to explain the content a little bit more, that while parents are sleeping all through the night, their children toil in commerce. So she again is summarizing the text. And then she concludes the paragraph by describing the function in quite a bit of detail, like the effect of the repeating phrases is to highlight the stagnancy of their sleep. The child labor was allowed to continue because children were making the goods. She's speaking to how this is, the student is speaking to how this might accumulate their guilt encouraging a new focus. So the student's thinking about the function at the end of the paragraph. Let's practice with an older text that I think is a good review for all of us. This is from the Declaration of Independence. You've probably read this in some history class, maybe an English class. I want you to, again, pause the feed and identify a pronoun or antecedent, an example of repetition, and parallel structure that you think really helps to impart the message that all men are equal and that men should overthrow any government that violates their rights, their civil duties and liberties. So pause the feed and see if you can find a pronoun and its matching antecedent, an example of repetition, and parallel structure that are significant in conveying that particular argument. I love this text. It's something that I use a lot with my students, and they get very frustrated because we spend days talking about the Declaration of Independence. But I do think that it's so well constructed. So let's start by looking at the pronouns. Again, it's not as simple as just looking at the pronoun. You have to look, what is it replacing? What is the antecedent as well? Especially when you have an older text like this. You'll see a lot of theys and these and this and its. So you have to know what those things are. In the beginning, you'll see he says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they, and in that case, that pronoun they is referring to all men. He then continues to say that among these alienable rights, so that among these is referring to the alienable rights, so that's the antecedent, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, there we go, to secure these rights, the rights he's referring to there, the antecedent is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then we also see an it. He says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. In this case, the it is referring to the government. So just a reminder, when you find a pronoun, try to look before it just a little bit to identify the subject matter. What I love about this, and I could talk about for 4 days and drive you crazy, is the way he sets up his sentence structure, something we're talking about on Thursday, is that he provides this pronoun that's qualifying, describing, modifying something that happened in the previous. So all of his sentences fit nicely together. It creates this rhythm that everything is related, everything is cohesive. You might have seen some repetition, especially toward the bottom. He says, it is their right, it is their duty. Oh, sorry, excuse me, I need to backtrack. I got ahead of myself. The repetition is things like government, rights, and then you've obviously seen they and them. And you could see that, or you could make the case that the repetition is highlighting the role that a man plays in securing rights from a particular government. So those words are repeated. I didn't annotate those because it just would have taken too long. So I didn't annotate that. So then we get to our parallel structure. Sorry. Parallel structure is, it is their right, it is their duty, develops a cadence. It's easier to follow. Those two ideas are emphasized. We also see in the second to last sentence, he says, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. In this case, he's repeating the word, the structure, the history and a history, to put them in contrast to one another, to emphasize that his injuries are synonymous to him being a leader. So he's putting those two right next to each other. So I'm sorry, just to clarify that we have the parallel structure with it is their right, it is their duty, and that history, the history and a history are parallel to one another in order to showcase how the King of Great Britain, who he is today, is one full of repeated injuries. All right, to review, we were looking at how there are certain elements in a text that relate to other elements in a text, how there are the relationships that are created in pronouns, repetition, and parallel structure. And that when you look at these, especially when it comes to pronouns, that might get in the way of your reading. So you need to understand how to read for pronouns, and that a lot of you tend to focus on repetition and parallel structure, specifically in speeches, and that writers will use those tools to establish a pace, to create balance, to include some variety so it doesn't get too stagnant, and then to obviously, if they're being repeated, emphasize key ideas and words. So tonight your homework is to read an excerpt of an AP prompt. And I want you to start by reading through it and trying to think through what is the main idea or what is the argument first, because that's what should always guide our reading, not just searching for repetition. Always start with the argument in mind. Then I want you to identify any pronouns and antecedents that you think are particularly important to conveying that message, any examples of repetition or parallel structure, and make sure you're keeping in mind the difference between repetition and parallelism. Before we sign off, I know sometimes teachers watch these before they assign them to their students. Just wanted to give teachers a quick notice that Quill and College Board have partnered together to create a system that is going to help students improve their writing structures. So things like complex sentences, relative clauses, compound complex sentences, participial phrases, etc. And essentially what happens is that the teacher will sign up on Quill, it's free, and then they will assign a brief survey that goes over 17 items for students to take. Then it will kind of parse out for teachers which students need help with which skills. They'll provide some suggested activities. But what I think is really great about this is that then the teacher can assign them those activities to students, and the students get immediate feedback from Quill on how to revise and strengthen their grammar. So I just want to provide that tip if there are any teachers out there watching. If you're interested, you can go to quill.org/AP to learn more information. But I think it could be a really useful tip for teachers who are trying to help improve the construction of their students' writing, not just the ideas. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys tomorrow. I hope you have a great day. And again, that you take some time to rejuvenate and recharge your batteries.